Please give a warm welcome to producer Tim Rummel and director-producer Christopher Burke. Welcome, welcome. I'll start with you, Christopher. One of the beautiful things about this documentary is that at its heart, it's a love story. When did you understand the entryway for the audience?
Pretty quickly upon starting to film. And just to back up a little bit, the reason I got involved in this is Brian is my old friend from college. And when I had found out about his diagnosis, I raised my hand and offered to help in any way that I could, because naturally, Brian being Brian, the letting people know about the diagnosis came with a 40-page PowerPoint presentation about how he was going to systematically dismantle the disease with the help of all of his friends, and a call to action, like, what can you do to help? And I said, well, you know, I'm not a neurologist, but I can make movies, so let me know if you want that ever. And what started as a little 60-second spot for the launch of I Am ALS, some of which you see in the film where he's sitting there and he says, welcome to I Am ALS, I'm sorry you're here, but I'm glad you found us. That was that. But I met Sandra for the first time on the same day that I filmed that in the beginning of 2019, and I very quickly saw the dynamic between them and realized, oh, there's a lot more going on here, not just with Brian and his fight, but with what the two of these people are going to do together with the, you know, I guess for lack of a better term, the kinetic energy that they create when they work together.
Mm-hmm. To Tim, the film, it's never modeling. I mean, there is some really sad, depressing moments in the documentary, but you find this rhythm and tone into the piece that is not modeling. You know, was that something that you guys were conscious when you were making them?
Yeah, I think it was something that was always there. As you know, we were capturing Brian's spirit, and I met Brian in the making of this film because I'd worked with Chris before and got to be really close with him, and he's deeply inspirational and the most positive person I've ever met in my life. And so when we would watch like a rough cut of the film, we asked ourselves, is this true to his spirit? And if it didn't capture that humor and positivity, we knew we weren't doing service to that story.
And when you were editing the film, is that something that was also your North Star?
It was, definitely, because look, it's a really tough subject matter to tackle. ALS is not anyone's idea of a good time, but we knew from the beginning how important this story was, and it was all the more impetus to make sure that it would be something that could clip along and keep people's attention and have a bunch of good jokes and show that love between people and be something that's entertaining as well as educational and not didactic and sort of hitting you over the head with a ton of facts. Yes, there's facts and figures in there to a point, but the idea is to show you the human story and then hopefully inspire you to go do more research on whatever aspect of it appeals to you. And one other fun anecdote is all of the pop songs that you hear in this film are from a giant Spotify playlist that Brian sent me at the beginning of this. He said, these are the songs that I use to help me get up in the morning. And keep in mind, this is a guy for whom getting up in the morning is meaning it means a more and more difficult thing as time goes on. He physically can't without being lifted now, but he gets up and faces every day with an insane level of practical optimism that I've never witnessed in another human being.
I want to grab onto something that you just mentioned about the two of them and seeing them so much. This could have easily become a documentary about statistics and about science. You evade that aspect and instead put them at the forefront. Can you tell us, either of you, about that choice?
I mean, I think to us, the film is a story about building a movement. I mean, that was what's unique about what Brian and Sandra, there have been some very powerful and beautiful films about people with ALS that have been made before. But what's unique about Brian and Sandra is the movement that they built. Mm-hmm. And so in capturing that story, it's it's exactly how that worked, where it's Brian, and then it's Brian and Sandra, and then you see how they organize and other people come on board. And so that to us was more important than the statistics and the facts and figures.
Yeah, and ultimately the whole thing happens against the backdrop of public policy, but one of the things that's really important to remember is that policy is about people. And we wanted to put the people at the forefront because this whole thing is about getting those patient voices that have been so marginalized and silenced for so long to be out in the forefront, leading the charge for their own futures and for the generations that are going to come after.
We've mentioned that you put Brian and Sandra at the forefront, but then you made the choice of surrounding them with families. Can you tell us about the genesis of that choice?
Yeah, I mean, we all felt, and we were talking with Brian and Sandra about this throughout the whole thing, that we wanted to accurately reflect the movement. And so I was asking Brian, okay, who else could we get to know? I'll go wherever in the country. I have to see some other people here who are a part of this movement. And Juan Reyes, who plays an important role in the film, has since become a board member of IMALS. He's a veteran. He represents that community, which is really important. We don't get too deeply into it, but veterans are anywhere from 2 to 10 times more likely to be diagnosed with ALS than the average person. So Department of Defense views it as a service-connected illness, and therefore one of the reasons why they're more willing to be part of that funding push, and all of that stuff was sort of being triangulated. But we wanted to make sure that we gave as many angles into the story, if you will. Like a lot of people are going to identify with the universal humanity of Brian and Sandra's story, but maybe someone has already lost a spouse like Nicole, or has another way to connect with one of the other families. And those are all people who are a big part of the movement, and we wanted to just accurately reflect that sort of growing concentric circles of effort that are happening with so many different people.
I couldn't help but think about their background in politics and how instrumental that was to them starting this movement. Can you tell us about that aspect, their knowledge of politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. I think the way Sandra puts it is her whole career as a communications person in politics was to find people who are affected by policy and get them on the news and get them, help them speak and advocate for policy that was being pushed. And then Brian and Sandra became the sort of regular people. And so they were uniquely positioned to make something happen.
We talked briefly prior to this about the toll on Sandra that this it's taken. Can you talk a little bit about that, and why did you guys choose not to focus on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, as she said, she has given up her entire life because of this, and what other alternative is there really, right, when your spouse is stricken with a disease like this? And she's been the CEO and founder of nonprofits. I mean, she is a go-getter type of person as well, and here she is watching Brian decline and trying to work side by side with him to affect all of this change, but it does take a massive toll on her. And, we didn't want to make that the primary aspect of the story, but we did want to show it in a few key moments, such as when she very memorably breaks down crying on the kitchen floor. And that was just like a brutal, honest moment. And I think to gloss over that would be a mistake, because there are, these diseases don't affect just the person who has it. It's the families, it's the friends, it's the community. And we wanted to show that. And these kinds of panels, oftentimes when she's able to attend, she'll get into talking about it more. And just having that viewpoint represented is important.
Yeah, I'd just add that, I think we've gotten feedback from people who've seen the film that as caregivers, they feel seen in it. And I think it's something that we don't do enough to shine a light on.
You mentioned tough moments. We watch her in the kitchen, the scene with the needle on the chest. There's some really tough things that you captured. Did you guys, did you have full access? Were there things that you were told you cannot
No, there was nothing that was off limits. Although Brian likes to say likes to clarify that Sandra filmed him in the shower, not me. Although I would have if I'd needed to. I mean, we're old friends. Nothing's off limits. But that being said, no, they were very open, and I think at the beginning when it became clear that we were going to make a full-blown documentary out of this, we had that conversation. We said, look, it's going to be all the highs and lows and everything in between, and fortunately, they had enough trust in me and Tim that they knew we weren't going to be exploitative or put anything out there that they weren't comfortable with. And obviously, there's a lot of sensitive medical information and this and that has no place being in this. But the universal human experience of what they're going through and pulling a needle out of his heart, or as he says, my heart is on the other side, right? What I love about that moment in particular is it's completely brutal, and you see her struggling with it, but also they're cracking each other up and laughing.
Yeah.
And that is sort of the essence of the beauty that is still there under all of the pain.
And surrounded by the subject, the film remains objective even through the toughest moments. What was it like for the two of you to be surrounded by this and keep moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Chris really answer this question, but the moment for me that I always think about is there's the moment when they're writing the testimony before their final testimony in front of Congress, and where Brian says, "I'm dying," and they have that conversation, and it's one of the most powerful moments in the film, when I see it, and I always remember when I see that Chris is standing in that hotel room with his camera, just
I'm
5 feet away
right now. Like they're at the little desk, and I'm like crammed into the corner, trying not to breathe, so I'm not too shaky with the shot.
But I mean, this is the story you're telling about a dear friend, so it's a heavy moment for you too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been really hard for sure, and I've had to, we're taught as awareness of mental health increases in this day and age. You're taught not to bottle things up, but guess what? That's what I've had to do for the last few years because it hasn't been appropriate to really let that out. Although my wife, who's a social worker, explained to me this theory of grieving outwards, and so like if I was there with Brian and he was upset or Sandra was upset, I can't then reflect that back in on them because they're the ones who are fundamentally suffering the most. But then I would like keep it together and then get on the phone with my wife at night and cry about it, and then she, talk to my kids about it and stuff like that. So you kind of like it has this cascade effect. But ultimately, I knew that I was doing something important, and that the moment I remember is in the hallway after his first testimony where he's walking alone and crying, and I'm there walking backwards with the camera. As a human being, I wanted to put the camera down and give him a hug, but I couldn't do that. And at the end of that hallway, I found myself apologizing to him, saying, like, I'm sorry, I feel like, I just feel like this is crazy that I'm here filming you. And he just looked at me through his tears and said, no, you don't have anything to be sorry for. You're doing your job. That's why we're here. He wiped his eyes, straightened himself up, and went back to work. And that's kind of what we've all had to do. And Brian has really set the tone for that for the 4 years or so that it took to get this done.
What was your knowledge about ASL before you started shooting, and how, actually to the two of you, and how has it evolved through the process?
I knew nothing about ALS prior to this, other than exactly what Brian knew when he was diagnosed. Oh, Lou Gehrig, yeah, I've heard of him. He had a fatal disease. That's about all I knew. I knew of the Ice Bucket Challenge. I remembered it, but nothing really. And I've since learned a ton, and I now am probably sort of annoying. I get like less than 5 minutes into any conversation with a stranger. I'm like, so ALS and other neurodegenerative diseases. But, you spend so much time with something and it just sort of sinks into your entire being. And I do think one of the big light bulbs for me has been learning, as you see in the Times Square scene and on our poster, about the connectivity between ALS and the other, cousin neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's, MS, frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's, the list goes on and on. Now, they're not the same, and of course, I am not a doctor. I don't really know what I'm talking about, but in the sense that they are all different versions of the brain breaking down, and isn't there probably a lot more connectivity there than we'd previously thought? Well, the answer is yes, there is, and so Brian and Sandra are making a big effort to get people rowing in the same direction within those different communities, sharing research better, breaking down the silos, and ultimately, hopefully, getting us to treatments and cures for many of those diseases much sooner than we would have otherwise.
Yeah.
I mean, we call ALS a rare disease, but when you really look at it in that way, like everyone will be touched by one of those diseases in their lifetime, whether it's them or a loved one.
Yeah, and apologies, I'm dyslexic, so I keep saying ASL.
No,
and
that's okay.
It's, I know it's
knew what you meant.
ALS. Did you, when you you set out to do this 60-second spot for Brian, when did you understand that you had this narrative arc that, you know, the law, it was going to go into law, and like, wow, you're documenting this incredible journey?
I understood, I didn't know what it was going to be, but I knew that something big would happen at that first testimony where he talks to Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro in an otherwise largely empty bench of congresspeople who should have been there. That was the time, because I really embedded with him in a verite style at that moment and was tagging along and just seeing everything he was doing. It was like, okay, well, he's going to do this again and he's going to go somewhere else. I have to be there. I have to see what he does. At that moment in early 2019, no one had envisioned yet the Act for ALS and what it would be, but Brian later wrote that law along with his colleagues at IMALS. That he wrote it. I mean, he's a lawyer, and they did that, and so I pretty much knew from then. So that was April 2019, and then it took us until October of 2022 to really finish it.
I'm curious, Tim, how, from a producer's point of view, how do you continue supporting a project like this where you don't know that you may have, you know, a closure to the...
That's exactly right. I mean, we had a cut of the movie before that law was passed, and we were having the conversation of, well, what's the ending? How do we end this film? And then the day that it passed, you know, Brian and Sandra let us know, and the community let us know, and we said, I think we have an ending. This is good.
And we really wanted to end on a high note, like, no, the disease isn't cured, but what an amazing moment that was to get that law passed that appropriates up to $100 million per year for these expanded access programs and creating easier pathways for people to get access to these treatments. And that's not all they're doing. I mean, collectively, between the Act for ALS and other funding initiatives, they've now raised over $1 billion in federal funding for this disease that previously was just, as Brian says, wandering in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. It's unbelievable. They really are just getting started. Yeah.
I mean, we've seen documentaries where is one person fighting against a disease, and we have that in your film, but we also have this creating of a movement. I mean, has there been any other doc that documents this journey like this, so complex?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, again, there's pieces of it that have been done in other films, but I have never seen it in this way. And it's unique to what's Brian and Sandra's abilities and what they've accomplished. And they actually have published a playbook of how to do this, and you can get it from IMALS because they want anyone facing this kind of adversity, whether it be another neurodegenerative disease or something else, to know how to fight and organize and accomplish change. So it is a really unique story, and I'm really pleased that it kind of comes through in the film, that people see, oh, wow, yes, this is about movement building. This is something I can take and apply to my life.
And what has been the reaction to the film from the ALS community?
Yeah, I think just as Tim mentioned with caregivers, largely ALS patients feel seen by this. And whenever possible, we bring in the community to different screenings. We've been very popular with the Real Abilities Film Festival, which has regional ones where, you know, we oftentimes are bringing ALS patients up to do the panels, and we're getting the word out there more. I think it's impossible to capture the full experience, and there's so many different thousands of ways that people do experience this, but just from some of the feedback we get, not just from ALS patients, but also one of the most meaningful conversations I've had was with a Parkinson's patient who came to see us at a film festival afterwards and just like gave me a big hug, and like we had this moment of bonding about this, and she said she felt like this had captured her experience with young onset Parkinson's more than anything else she'd ever seen. So I think we're on the right track.
You mentioned to us that you and Brian went to your class reunion and show the film. Can you tell the audience that experience?
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, 20 years ago in college, I always like to say Brian was the guy that I was convinced I would be voting for president someday, and you probably get that from watching this film. He's so charming and smart and all of those things, such a good leader. I certainly never imagined that at our 20th reunion, he'd be there fully paralyzed in a power chair, and we'd be showing this movie that I made about him. And yet, it sort of makes sense that if it was going to go that way, that we should be commemorating it and showing this work that he's done. Anyway, we were in this beautiful Gothic hall at Yale and filled with a bunch of our classmates, most of whom I hadn't seen in 20 years. And it was sort of like jarring and surreal, but ultimately, like, at the end of the movie, Brian was sitting in the center, sort of in an accessible area, and everyone stood up and was like clapping and crying, and I was trying to film it. Phone was a little shaky. I was not immune to the emotion myself. So yeah, beautiful and terrible all at once. I don't know. I can't really describe it any other way. You wish it hadn't have gone this way, but if it had to, you have to do your best to make something out of it.
Well, it's such a powerful film, and thank you for making it and for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you all for
Yeah,
coming.
thanks everyone for coming out. Special thanks to Santa Barbara International Film Festival, who programmed us in 2023. We were here in February, so some of you, I mean, maybe even have seen that. But we love it here, and thank you so much for having us back. And yeah, happy to stick around afterwards and talk to folks out in the lobby if anyone's got more questions.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody.